of a modern art museum in Mexico City, a group of young people are gathering for a meeting. Not so long ago, they were considered some of the United States' best and brightest. Today, they're Mexico's again.
This is the dreamer generation. Mexicans who were undocumented minors in the United States who have now ended up in Mexico, either deported or voluntarily left over the past few years. And they're all taking their seats in front of a giant screen which has been divided up into little boxes. Each of those is a dreamer in the United States who this group will be connecting to.
Deportees in Mexico and dreamers in the US could share their experiences and bring their issues directly to government agencies attending the event for education, immigration and work. A dreamer called Laura in California wanted to know if she could return to Mexico for family reasons without jeopardizing her life in the US. Utah, David asked about educational grants for Mexicans to access US colleges. For those who are back permanently, though, adapting to Mexico has been a shock. Most of the returnees are bilingual and fluent in English, but US high school diplomas or degrees often aren't easy to validate in Mexico.
My name is Angelica Mitre, and I'm currently a dreamer here in Mexico.
Angelica, or Angie, moved back to Mexico when her father was deported. From being the new girl in the class who spoke no English when she moved to the US, she's again found herself as a foreigner back in her home country too.
I've always been really passionate about school, but being there in the States, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do a college career or have a college degree because I was not a US citizen. Here in Mexico, we have to look for the opportunities. It's not as easy as over there. You have to literally fight for a space in a college. You just don't get out of high school and be like, okay, I have a college. No, you do an exam. A lot of teenagers do not make it in, so they just start working, and that's how education in Mexico goes lower and lower and lower.
Our vision is to prove that the American dream can also be accomplished in Mexico, and also to let the entire world know that this is a humanitarian crisis.
Israel Concha is one of the event organizers. A returnee himself, he founded a non-profit organization called New Comienzos, Spanglish for New Starts, to provide a support network for people who were going through what he did.
I still remember that day, at that moment when I was at the border with Mexico, at the international bridge, where I could actually see where Mexico started. For some reason, I just started tearing, you know, my hopes, my dreams, my entire life. I thought the U.S. was also my country. Pretty much they kicked me out just like a criminal.
Beyond the emotional upheaval, the biggest problem for deportees, says Israel, is negotiating Mexico's tangled bureaucracy. This is where New Comienzos tries to come in.
We created this interactive system that looks for specific keywords throughout the internet. For example, repatriated, bilingual, need a job, need assistance, and automatically this system connects with the people that need these services. So that's how we've been able to help over 3,000 people.
They don't know their rights, and they think that as long as they are undocumented people, they don't have rights, and they do.
Unice Rendon has worked for successive administrations on immigrant issues and is one of the deportees' top political allies. She says most still don't know their entitlements on both sides of the border.
So we have to make them aware of that, and also we are doing a lot of spots and information that now a little problem or a little mistake can have very big consequences.
This is your identity card in Mexico.
Yes, but also this is my profession. I'm an engineer.
Right.
One man who knows just how big those consequences can be is Francisco Juarez. Deported after 14 years living in Kentucky, he says he was arrested for trespassing, just taking a shortcut home through a parking lot.
Because I was in the United States for 14 years.
In Kentucky, Francisco had set up his own theatre company and had had plays performed by local directors. Now he's living with his father again in the Mexican state of Morelos. I met him as he emerged from the government offices with his new national ID card.
It's difficult because it's starting from zero. I'm here again. I don't have any work experience here. And also I need some documents to start working. When I was in the United States, I just had to wait 2 days to get a job, and here I have 3 months just to get the papers to work.
But beyond the logistical difficulties, Francisco says he has also experienced stigma, isolation, even ageism and racism since returning to Mexico.
The way that I move here is different the way that I move in the United States. I feel more free to do things over there than here. I'm start doing theater there, and was easier than start doing theater here, because here the arts is not a priority. And the United States, you can get money for different resources.
Connecting deportees like Francisco with support groups like New Comienzos will take time.
Months just to get the papers to work.
But beyond the logistical difficulties, Francisco says he has also experienced stigma, isolation, even ageism and
the BBC World Service.
Because here the arts is not a priority, and because here the arts is not a priority, and United States, you can get money for different resources.
Connecting deportees like Francisco with support groups like New Comienzos will take time. Most are so disoriented on coming back to Mexico, they simply don't know where to start. With President Trump unlikely to slow the pace of deportations established by his predecessor, such groups will have their work cut out, helping young people to realize new dreams in Mexico instead.
Do you guys know what our vision is?
That your American dream can actually be true in Mexico.
Will Grant, with the Dreamers now back in Mexico City. Just before we go, a recap of our top story this hour. The US has requested an urgent meeting at the UN Security Council to discuss North Korea's latest missile tests. US officials are reported to have confirmed that the weapon was an intercontinental ballistic missile. But does that mean North Korea is nearer to militarizing a nuclear warhead? This is what Shay Cotton, a weapons expert on North Korea, told NewsHour.
North Korea has conducted 5 nuclear tests, and if they haven't figured out how to miniaturize a nuclear weapon by now, they're probably only 1 test away.
That's it from NewsHour. From all of us, goodbye.
You're with the BBC World Service. Before the news, we get creative.
I'm looking at this thinking light, sky, drift, transparency.
From poetry and visual arts to literature,
Professional writers shouldn't do that, but I was crying when I was writing because it's very emotional.
we get inside the creative mind.
How do you simply yet profoundly connect and say something?
Discover global arts and culture on the BBC World Service. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our North America editor John Sopel reports from New York. Let's speak to the BBC's Anna Holligan, who's following the trial in The Hague.
Our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette has just returned from Aleppo.
Goes over to Kinshasa now. Our correspondent Thomas Fessy.
Online at bbcworldservice.com, this is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Sit back and relax. Enjoy a glass of South African Chenin Blanc. Now, imagine the lives of the farm workers who grow the grapes for it.
People have to work from sunrise to sunset. If you are a wife and a woman, how would you feel if your family could only start 8 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the evening because you have to still prepare food for them?
23 years after the end of apartheid, they still work for low pay and can't even dream of owning the vineyards that produce those wines. One man wants to change things.
The problem is I own the land. I own the land because my forebears stole it. And the farm workers who live there, who are my responsibility, my patriarchal responsibility, are there because their land was stolen from them. How are you going to fix it? Well, you've got to give the land back.
Join me, Audrey Brown from BBC Africa, for a unique story from South Africa's winelands after the news.
This is the BBC News. Hello, I'm Jonathan Izard. The United States has requested an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss North missile test. US officials are reported to have confirmed that the weapon was an intercontinental ballistic missile, meaning North Korea may now be able to target Alaska. China and Russia have put forward their own plans to rein in North Korea's activities. President Putin spoke at a news conference following a meeting with the Chinese president.
With our joint initiative, based both on a Russian project of a step-by-step settlement of the Korean Peninsula crisis and based on the Chinese idea of freezing North Korea's nuclear activities and the military exercises of the United States and South Korea at the same time.
The European Commission has released a new action plan on migrants crossing the Mediterranean, committing some $90 million to stem the flow into Italy. More than half is to boost the Libyan Coast Guard's capacity to stop traffickers launching boatloads of migrants out to sea to be rescued. The rest is to help Italy feed, house and process the migrants who get there. More from our Europe correspondent, Damien Grammaticus.
Once again, the migrant crisis is placing a strain on the EU. This new action plan is a response to a cry for help from Italy. It's seen rising arrivals this year, 85,000 so far. The EU also wants to lessen the numbers turning to smugglers, so it's asking member states if they'll take some refugees direct from African countries if they're screened by the UN. And the Commission says it'll help Italy draft a new code of conduct governing the rescue of migrants at sea by private charities and NGOs. Privately operated boats are currently saving thousands every week.
Spanish Coast Guards believe around 50 migrants have drowned in the western Mediterranean. 3 men, which they said had more than 50 people on board when it left Morocco. The dinghy drifted for days and deflated. On the first ever visit to Israel by an Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi has talked of the scope for expanding the relationship between the two countries. Mr. Modi said he hoped to transform their economic ties and build what he called a robust security partnership. From Jerusalem, here's Yolande Nell.
India and Israel have had diplomatic relations for 25 years, but both sides say these are now closer than ever. India is one of the world's biggest defense buyers, and recently Israel's become a major supplier. At a news conference with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mr. Modi said their two countries wanted greater economic engagement and had in common strong technology, innovation and security needs. He suggested they were linked by an ancient bond and praised the contributions of India's small Jewish community.
Here's the world news from the BBC. The new French government has sailed through its first confidence vote after the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, set out proposals for public spending cuts and labour reforms. Mr. Philippe warned Parliament that the country had to be weaned off its addiction to public spending. He said France was dancing on a volcano that was rumbling ever louder, with $2.3 trillion of public debt, almost a year.
Okay.
UNESCO has removed 2 African national parks from its list of endangered World Heritage Sites. It said conditions in the Simian National Park in Ethiopia had improved, in part because of measures to reduce overgrazing and the impact of visitors. It also said that the Comoé National Park in Ivory Coast was no longer at risk. From Abidjan, Tamazin Ford reports.
This massive piece of land stretches across more than 1 million hectares in the northeast of the country. It was put on UNESCO's danger list in 2003 after the country's first civil war. Poaching was rife. It was thought the rare West African chimpanzee and forest elephant populations had been completely wiped out. 95% of the country's entire rainforests have disappeared in the last 50 years. Now, both the chimpanzee and elephant populations are reproducing again.
The world champion cyclist Peter Sagan of Slovakia has been disqualified from this year's Tour de France for knocking British cyclist Mark Cavendish into the barriers in a sprint to the line at Vittel on stage 4. Cavendish was helped by medics before crossing the line with his shoulder badly gashed. One of Mexico's most controversial artists, José Luis Cuevas, has died at the age of 83, a leading light of a generation of artists in Mexico known as the Cuevas accused the country's famous muralists such as Diego Rivera and others of being too close to the government. His depictions of dark, deformed, animal-like figures in paint and sculpture were a sharp break from the socialist muralism of the 1940s and 50s in Mexico. BBC News.
a farm in particular used to put people in oil drums, and after they've been dumped in oil drums, beat them up with a sambok, which are plastic.
A whip, basically.
A whip, basically.
Nico Jansen, farm manager.
The oldest house on the farm dates from before 1690. In the 1680s census, there were already 2 settlers here, 2 European hunters, hunting in our river for hippopotami and elephants, of which, of course, there are none left.
Mark Soames, farm owner.
I told him I don't trust white people at all.
So, in this room, what you have to remember is that this house was built by slaves. This is the ship that brought my ancestors here.
Mark is a 6th-generation South African who began investing in this farm 17 years ago.
There was this ship, the Arab, which I knew my ancestors had come on the Arab. I thought the Arab it's sunk in Table Bay.
Nico comes from a long line of farm and domestic laborers in the Cape Winelands.
People have to work from sunrise to sunset. And how, if you are a wife and a woman, how would you feel if your family could only start eating 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the evening because you have to still prepare food for them?
So it's underneath the city of Cape Town is the ship that brought my ancestors here. This valley, which is now called Franschhoek, French Quarter, was called Olifantshoek, Elephant's Quarter. It's so sad. I mean, everything about South Africa is just excruciatingly painful, in layers upon layers.
Everybody I meet on this farm calls Mark Prof, or the Professor. Nico sowed nursery plants on the farm before Mark took it over.
Our first winemaker was German, but he was a boer, like in the Afrikaans sense, a boer. So one of the things he said to Professor was, listen, I don't like the idea that Nico's people doesn't work even on weekends and stop working so early. And then when Professor talked to me about it, I said to him, listen, that's exactly what I want to stop. I want to stop the slavery system.
It's an historic farm. It was established as a farm in 1690. So it dates the occupation by colonists. It was one of those places where the trouble began. The taking of the land is actually the essence of what colonization is about. And remarkably, all these years later, and all these years after the end of apartheid, the land is still pretty much in the same hands.
I'm Audrey Brown, reporting for the BBC World Service, and it is beautiful here on this farm with its tragic layers. Nico takes me for a stroll on a late summer afternoon after the harvest.
Okay, what happens is are there things, snakes?
Yeah, there are snakes, and 2 familiar snakes, which are the most serious snakes. We got the Cape Cobra and Puff Adder.
Seriously, yes.
Seriously, I am the farm.
Wow.
Yeah, and
have you found them on this farm already? Have people been bitten?
Hundreds. No. Our people are very clever.
Okay, then check it out.
Avoid being bitten. But it could happen any time.
Okay, well, I better be one of your clever people and not get bitten. Okay. All right, let's stand here.
Yeah.
I said, now, I must just explain to BBC World Service listeners, I'm standing in the middle of a vineyard surrounded by mountains, the mountains that... Picturesque mountains. One of them is called The Lady on Her Back, the other one is called Devil's Tooth, and the other one is called Breasts. And if you saw them, you'll see exactly what people mean when they call them those, because it's so obvious.
There's laughter here, but bitter inequality.
The essence of the problem, obviously, is the ownership of the land. How can you infuse your serfs in the project to transform your farm? The problem is I own the land. I own the land because my forebears stole it. And the farm workers who live there, who are my responsibility, my patriarchal responsibility, are there because their land was stolen from them, or because they were yanked there from foreign parts as slaves. And they were just deposited there by history. So on my land, I own it because of that history. They own nothing because of that history. How are you going to fix it? Well, you've got to give the land back.
So far, so obvious. Just give back the land. But can Mark bring himself to do it? After all,
I said to myself things like, well, it wasn't me who took the land. Who do I give it to? Some symbolic bushman? Or do we divide it up so that each family gets a little piece? And then I told myself, what about food security if we do that, forgetting, of course, that it's a wine farm? What I was doing was making excuses, not least of them, and the most practical of them, was, well, their farm workers don't know how to run a farm. If I was to give the farm to them, it would end in tears, But those are excuses. I really mean it when I say that morally there's no question about it, but that the land should be given back. And I finally came to the realization, and I'm not proud to say this to you at all, but it is the truth. I came to the realization I don't want to. For reasons of my own self-interest, despite knowing the history, despite facing all of those historical facts, there were 3 crimes against humanity, the stealing of the land, slavery, and apartheid, all committed on my farm. And knowing all of that, I wasn't able to do the right thing. If morals were the only consideration, that is the right thing to do. If you have stolen goods, you can't keep them. And if you really want to rectify what's wrong in South Africa still today, and let me make it plain, what's wrong still today is that the perpetrators of apartheid have kept the spoils. And incidentally, I don't know if you've noticed, no white South African seems to have supported apartheid.
Yeah, it is a very famous joke in South Africa that there's no white person seems to have. Did you vote for apartheid?
No, as it happens, I didn't, but I know it carries no special meaning because everyone says that.
But you knew people who did.
Yes, and I think, to be honest, my own mother did. I remember her crying when Verwoerd was assassinated. We were not a particularly progressive family.
But he continues to try and make progressive changes.
I met with them and wanted to make plans with them as to how we can transform this farm, and it was quite impossible to have any kind of conversation with them.
I gave him just a piece of a mind. I said, who the hell do you think, Mark Soms, you're coming from abroad?
There was no precedent that you discuss with the landowner what's going to happen. I'm sure they didn't trust me. All sorts of things were factored into the impossibility of us planning together.
I'm indigenous to this farm and I'm indigenous to this land. And who do you think you people coming and you just buy up farms and kick people off? I'm sick and tired of it.
So I started making a few reforms on my own bat as I had to, changing employment conditions and housing conditions and so on. And when the workers started to see that I really meant it, that I'm not like my predecessors, to my absolute horror, the conclusion they seemed to have come to was I'm a fool.
And he asked me if I wanted to come back and work for him. And I said, no, are you crazy? I'm not going to work for any white man anymore.
And so within a few months, we were in the most terrible situation where people were not turning up for work, taking advantage, as I experienced it, of my goodness, and feeling, these people are not grateful. And so in a few months, I'd become my own worst nightmare. I was speaking like a white South African farmer, and I was at loggerheads with my workers.
Things didn't look that well for the business. One of the ladies of the staff, of the kitchen staff, came to me and asked me, Nico, are you sure we're going to make it?
Somewhere along the line in this mess of difficult relationships and alienation, everything had to stop. Something new had to be done. Mark had to bring another part of himself to bear on this schism, the part of him that is a trained and practicing psychoanalyst. The farm stopped work.
If there's any one reason that I had to identify as to why I am more willing to face the unwelcome truth about what it means to be a white South African of my generation, it's probably that I was psychoanalyzed and learned how to look things in the eye. And, these are things which are self-evidently true, that we benefited. And
there must be another reason. I know psychoanalysts in South Africa, and they still slightly recalcitrant. They do acknowledge, yes, it happened. And even the way they talk about it, it happened, not it was done. I read somewhere that on your farm is an ancient site, archaeological site.
What I did after realizing what a mess we were really in was to do what one does clinically, which is take a history. When a patient presents with a complaint, with a symptom, you use your first port of call in terms of trying to understand what needs doing is to take a history so you understand how it all began. That's how you arrive at a diagnosis. So I thought, let's do this. Let's take a history of my farm. And so I brought in professional help in the form of archaeologists and historians, and we stopped farming. The farm workers and I collectively assisted the archaeologists in digging up the history of the farm in order to understand how did we come to this pass. And one of the most momentous things that happened in that process was the discovery of a Bushman settlement site, 6,000 years old, about 50 yards from my front door. So that sort of puts things into perspective, to see the physical evidence. And when I say physical evidence, I don't mean the odd shard or something. I mean, there were just thousands upon thousands of stone, beautiful microlithic stone tools and pottery shards and whatnot in this one spot. What more evidence do you need than that to demonstrate that this land was somebody else's? And it was made all the more dramatic, the finding of that settlement site, by dint of the fact that among the farm workers are the descendants of those dispossessed Bushmen and Khoikhoi, whose land this was. So it was an enormous eye-opener for us all.
Those excavations pulled everyone together.
I needed to do something. I could tell Professor, listen, you said you want to listen to me and help you understand the people. Then you have to take advice from me, how I want to change things, you know. So one of the first things was housing. I just said to him, listen, the housing condition that we're living in outdoors look like horse sheds. I want to change that. We have outside loos. I want to change that. We don't have proper electricity. I want to change that. And he listened. And that was why I still am here today, 17 years later, because I could see he's not like a normal, the white type of people that I used to know.
Facing the facts helps because it removes scales from, well, it removes blinkers from your eyes. You know, you then say, okay, now here's another fact. I'm not as I think I am, but I owe enormous debt. What am I going to do about it? How am I going to look myself in the mirror in the morning, living in this great big farmhouse, you know, knowing that it was built by slaves, for example, and that their descendants still work for me and have nothing?
Welcome to most of the Cape winemaking region of South Africa, the confluence of the lucrative tourism, wine and food industries. But this farm did something revolutionary for an area where hardly an acre of land has been given back in restitution.
The solution we came to is that I mortgaged my farm so that the farm workers could take out a bank loan so that they could buy the farm next door to me. And I did that together with a neighbor, a very decent and long-standing friend of mine, in fact from England, named Richard Astor. We mortgaged both of our farms, and you can get roughly 50% of the value of your farm from a bank, and so 50 plus 50 makes 100. So we then had sufficient funds borrowed from a bank in order for the farm workers to be able to buy a farm every bit as big as and beautiful and historic as Richard and mine. And then we faced the question, we're at risk if that farm doesn't succeed. And so we formed a partnership with the farm workers. So that's the model that we pioneered, if I can use that word, that we don't give up our land, but we, recognizing our debt, use it as a lever for enabling the landless people on our land to become landowners themselves.
Those beautiful shards are now in glass cases in a museum on the farm, and the names and the stories of those who came before Mark and Nico recorded on the walls. Part of the story Mark tells me is that of the very first white settlers who came as workers for the Dutch East India Company.
The first settlers were very simple people. They were not educated, they were illiterate, they were from the lowest rungs of European society. This was their great opportunity. You know, well, first of all, they worked for the company in horrid jobs, soldiers and sailors, but then when they were freed from their contracts because the company realized they needed farmers, this was like Hans Silberbach was a peasant from Germany, Jewish peasant from Germany. There's no way he could own land. Never. In the 17th century, a peasant, let alone a Jew, you know, never ever would own land. So he suddenly is given this piece of land. It's like, wow. The taking of these farms was a catastrophe for the local people. But put yourself in Hans Silberbach's shoes and ask, what would you do? You know, would you have said, no, it's not right? This is a drawing from 1710. This is our valley, but we don't know whether any one of these houses is ours. We don't know. We can't identify them.
And there came music.
When we did all of this research, the farm workers spontaneously became interested in their musical heritage. And without us designing it, we just had an explosion of music
When we discovered that there had been slaves on our farm since the 1690s to the 1830s, we also discovered that they always made music.
Susana Malchas runs a shop on the farm and is the chair lady of Isutstemmer, the Sweet Voices, one of the choirs here.
And after the emancipation of the slaves, they made a particular kind of music. So we decided we are going to make music as well. We formed a band and we write songs that talk about our history.
This is a very traditional song that's being sung here. And everybody's really enjoying themselves, starting to dance as well as the song is being played.
This is klopse music, made with homemade instruments, and it goes back to the days when slaves had one guaranteed holiday, the 2nd of January.
We now farm wine and music here. We have a huge musical project with real musicians. I mean, they get gigs and they have CDs and they win prizes and they earn a living from music.
But Mark's motivation, his motivation, why you? Why are you dissident?
Psychoanalysis, for all of the complexities that it appears to embody, really is a very simple business. It's about facing the facts, facing up to unwelcome truths, on the basis of the belief that our troubles come from us avoiding things, from things that we can't cope with emotionally. We avoid them, but they're there nevertheless. So, you can avoid reality, but it doesn't go away.
Part of that reality is that many people still won't accept this new ownership vision. Nico's co-workers, for instance, frankly just don't trust him.
You could see that people were trying to move away from me. People exclude me because they were scared that I might, besides the good that it could bring, it could also be that I could tell their personal things over to Professor, and
they felt that you could be like a spy, so they isolated you.
Exactly, and that I felt for a very long time.
Again, things begin to fail. The money is bleeding away. They need more investment. Mark goes to other farmers in the area for support. They're not all against him by any means. Many are helping their workers in other ways, but they're skeptical about even sharing their land.
The richest people around here, and some of them are progressive and enlightened people. But, this is the problem that we face in this country, that when it comes to the crunch, where you say, okay, what are you willing to give up? Or what are you willing to even just risk? We couldn't get anyone to do it. In the end, when it came to that final hurdle, nobody wanted to invest. Rich people are rich for a reason. If it's a question of, do I invest this in this safe bet, this high return thing, or do I invest this in this risky bet with low returns, but morally it's the right thing to do, they do the former, they don't do the latter.
Jacques Trudeau is part owner of a neighboring farm. He and his partners operate a workers' charity funded by the profits of their farms. He thinks Mark's model is unsustainable.
I believe what I'm doing is a better model than just handing over property. That's the bottom line. And handing over property is not going to help anybody.
It's also quite difficult to do, isn't it?
It's exactly, but it's not going to help anybody. Even I'm responsible to my partners who put up most of the money. I put up a very small amount because I'm not an extraordinarily wealthy guy. And it's an extraordinarily big farm, Crossroad. It requires a lot of people to help. Even that model, where I'm not handing over ownership, but I'm handing over profit, is worrying me every day. I have sleepless nights if it's going to work. Why? Because if it fails, I have failed the people that put up the money and I failed the community. So I take that responsibility very seriously. That's why. It's not easy.
And Jacques is right. The model didn't work. The farm is going under. But in an unbelievable twist in our story, the South African government steps in and saves the day. It buys a 50% stake in the farm under what is called the 50-50 policy. It gives the workers collective ownership of half of the land and the business. And in the middle of this harvest celebration, on the lawns here, surrounded by mature trees and historic buildings, Mark and Nico, standing on the massive festival stage, share their wonderful news.
Just one last thing I must tell you.
Remember, farm workers on Soms Delta always used to own a third of the farm. But this year, the government has stepped in and upped their share, and it's now come up to 50-50. And here's my co-owner, Nico Jansen. He's been the farm manager for all these years, and he's been that since 2001. Maybe he can say a few words before we hand back to Yapi host to start proceedings. Nico Jansen.
Hello, Professor, and
Hello, Professor, and hello, everyone. It's a big privilege for me to see you all here. It's a pleasure for us, our workers here, to thank you all for what you've done for the language Afrikaans. I want to talk about the word coincidence. If it exists, it means God didn't have a plan, but he did. Because look at us today. Professor, I just want to tell you not to worry. Remember when everybody laughed at the joke someone made about blacks being top dogs and the whites at the bottom? You all laughed at the joke. But now it's a fact. That day has come. We're in charge. I just want to say thank you once again to everybody here for this privilege.
Mark and Nico hug and throw their hands up victorious before handing the mic back to the MC. And the party begins. My visit to Soms Delta Farm for the BBC has unearthed a unique story in the Cape Winelands. But this is not a happy ending, because the story hasn't ended yet.
I have such an ambiguous position because they simultaneously see me as a troublemaker. And as a fig leaf. Whenever there's trouble, like recently there was a television program in Norway, and the wine stores started removing South African wine from their shelves in the wake of this program. It was about the conditions under which farm workers live on the farms producing these wines. So I was then asked by the industry, to make a statement, because they said it's not really fair, they've just found a few bad eggs. They wanted to trot me out as an example of what the industry is really like.
What did you do?
No, I didn't do it because I'm not what the industry is really like. But I also don't want to harm the South African wine industry. A lot of people's jobs depend on it. But I think that it's a very